right, good morning and welcome to Leadership Connection. Today I am just tickled to have the guest that we have today, which is Ron Moore, who is really a legend in terms of reliability and maintenance. I've known Ron for a long time, well over 20 years, I believe. At any rate, we're going to have a nice talk about Ron and his career and his background, and I think you're all going to enjoy the things we have to discuss today. So, Ron, tell me about your background, the companies you worked for, and the roles that you worked in over your career.
Goodness. Well, my first job was at Electric Boat, which is a bit of a misnomer. They built nuclear submarines. They came out of World War II, the old battery-operated pig boats, and ultimately developed Nautilus and so on. So that was my first job for 5 years, working on the Ohio class, the Fleet Ballistic Missile Submarine.
Now, did you actually get to take a cruise on one of those, or no?
No, I spent a lot of time in the submarine and in other submarines, but I was never on a sea trial or anything like that.
All right.
Wasn't something I would look forward to with enthusiasm. So, I mean, you got to be a special kind of person to want that, you know.
Yeah.
But sure. I admire greatly those submariners. You know, they are just outstanding people.
Yeah, I have a good friend that was a nuclear engineer on one.
Yeah. So from there, that was in Groton, Connecticut. Moved to Knoxville, Tennessee. Worked with a little environmental consulting company, mostly on power stations and testing power stations, and not for environmental performance, but mostly thermal and thermal efficiency and basic performance. Let me take care of this. Sorry. Anyways, then worked for another company that supported mostly power stations, nuclear and fossil, and ultimately went to work for a company called CSI. And most folks out there in our industry would know the old CSI. We made our strong suit was vibration monitoring instruments and software. And we went from a distant third in the marketplace, if that, to I think the unquestioned market leader. And that wasn't because of me, but mostly because we had good products, we had really good people, we worked as a team, and we really enjoyed helping people be successful. So I left there many years ago now, 25 or so years ago, and started a consulting business and basically went to the companies that we had been supporting, like DuPont and Weyerhaeuser and Alcoa and that lot, and started working with them, not just on maintenance, but on manufacturing performance and manufacturing management. And that has a whole lot more to do with things like leadership, alignment, engaging the workforce, those kinds of things. I'm really not technically very competent, as I demonstrated earlier when we were setting this up. But I sort of feel like I've got a pretty good handle on, issues around setting up systems and engaging the workforce and having the right, management principles in place. So that's what I've been doing ever since.
Really, the biggest part of what we do is getting people to understand the value of maintenance, the value of reliability, and understanding how that whole piece fits together, right? Yeah. So let me ask you, when were you first recognized, you think, as a leader? Was it a specific project you were working on or some type of equipment?
Well, I suppose if I look back, my bosses, I've had some really good bosses and I've had some horrid bosses.
Imagine that.
Yeah. Most of us, and that really is in the eyes of the beholder. Some people like to receive a lot of direction and attention and guidance. Maybe they like micromanagement. I hate it. My best bosses were ones that gave me some, simple instructions. Here's what I want you to do, and here's notionally how I want you to get it done. And if you need help, come see me.
Yeah.
And turn me loose.
My favorite is there was that movie where Tom Cruise, screams out, "Show me the money!" Right?
Yep.
And I had the boss he was show me the data, right?
Yeah.
And that was probably where I learned the most, was when I had a boss that said, "Show me the data, show me the proof of what you want to do is viable," right?
Yeah.
And that opens things up.
Well, one of the things I tried to do was anticipate, what would be needed, in the future, by my boss. And I had one boss, he was really quite good. And he said, don't, what, I don't remember his exact words, but the words in effect were, don't embarrass me. You make sure you cover my, can I say this, my ass?
Sure, why not?
Okay, well, you can bleep it out if you need to. And the point was, if you run into a problem, don't thrash around and let me get embarrassed.
Right, exactly.
By you.
Yeah.
And I remember one time I went to him and I was telling him about an issue and a problem, and he looked at me and he said, well, and I made some comment about, well, I assumed, and he said, let me show you how to spell assume. Probably most of us have had that experience, and he spelled it for me and advised me about how to avoid that in the future.
There we go.
He was a good boss,
You lead me right into the next question, which was there somebody in your career that you looked up to, like as a mentor, that you could tell us about?
Well, yeah, there were several, but one that comes, Tony Buell was a good boss. He was my boss at a little high-tech, high growth company. He was a really good boss because he did what I just described. He gave you some, general principles that he wanted to adhere to, and said, go make good things happen and keep me informed. And if you have a question, come back and see me. And if I see something wrong, I'll let you know. And, it was, well, let me compare him with a really bad boss I had. He was constantly, micromanaging. And he would stick his head over the cubicle and he would ask me a question about something. And I would say, well, there are 2 or 3 options. Here are the options. And I would say, well, which one would you prefer? Or, can you give me some guidance on this? He said, no, just pick the one you think's best and run with it. And then I would pick one of the 3 and, you got a 33% chance of being right. And, so 2 times out of 3, it wouldn't be the right one. And then he would publicly embarrass me, humiliate me. He would stick his nose over the cubicle and say, Ron, remember that decision you made? Well, it was wrong. But, that's, if you're going to do that, and you should occasionally, because you're going to have to, because nobody's perfect, but you need to do that in private.
Yeah, well, here's the thing, and this is something that I can remember telling my kids as they were going through school, and they'd have a teacher that they didn't like, and I tell them, this is part of life. You're going to have people like that your entire life. You're going to work for people like that, and so can you learn from it? And they'd look at me like, what in the heck are you talking about? I said, well, if you have to deal with somebody that you don't like the way they do things, don't ever do them that way yourself.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I had some bosses. I learned what not to do.
Exactly.
I mean, one of the better experiences I had was when I worked at this little company called TEC. In fact, Tony Buell was my boss there, but he left, before I did. And the company was highly leveraged, growing fast, borrowing money hand over fist, and all it takes is one hiccup for you to suddenly find yourself in deep, deep doo-doo.
Yeah.
And long story short, we ultimately went bankrupt because of that. And, I learned a lot there about what not to do. Don't over leverage, be a little bit conservative, give you guys, quite a bit of freedom, but, make sure you keep tabs on them to make sure they're headed in the right direction, that sort of thing. And,
Yeah.
again, there I had good and bad bosses. I had cheerleader bosses who didn't know what they were doing, but they could cheer. They couldn't play the game, So, and I had good bosses like Tony, and then I had engineer bosses who loved to engineer but couldn't manage their way out of a wet paper bag.
There you go.
So you learn a lot.
So
I think you learn as much from the bad ones as you do the good ones.
looking at your career as a whole, is there an event or an accomplishment that you would say you're most proud of?
Probably two answers to that. I'm quite proud of what we, and I say that really meaning the word we, accomplished at CSI. We had just an incredible group of engineers who could, design hardware and software and so on. We had an incredible group of folks who could, work to manage the cash so we didn't get in trouble. And, we had incredible customers, and our goal there was to make them successful. It wasn't to make us successful per se. It was to make them successful, because I always felt like if they're successful, they'll come back to you over and over. And you don't have to worry about, how much money you're making or whether or not people are doing their jobs. So you just focus on, and you get folks in the company focused on that. What do we got to do to make the customer successful? And that was an incredibly satisfying experience. The second bit would be the work that I've done with lots of folks around the world. Where you can go in, review their processes, and advise them about what they might need to do to improve their processes. And it's more about, we've said this, leadership, alignment, engaging the workforce, those kinds of things. And if you get those things right, everything else follows. And if you don't get those right, it doesn't matter what tool you've got or whether or not you're doing vibration analysis or whether or not you have a lot of this technology that we're so fond of these days. Now, the technology is really important. Don't mistake, that comment. But the technology isn't going to be very useful unless folks are working together to a common purpose.
Exactly.
So,
all right.
But,
and
yeah.
Going through that now with a customer that is, because of what's happened with COVID, they're saying this really drives a need for us to have smart machines, right? And I said to him, well, I think that would be a help to you, provided you really understand what comes with that, right? The machine is going to tell you that, I see or we have potential failures. You have to respond to it, right? If you could just continue to let it run like you have in the past, right? It's not going to tell you anything more than what you had in the past, right?
Yeah.
Well, we had routes. Now we got continuous monitoring. Well, I understand that. Did you respond to the routes when the Biden tech told you that you had a potential failure, or did you continue to let it run? Right. And those are the difficult questions that people need to be able to say, yeah, we understand that now, and we'll do something about it. Right.
Yeah.
So really looking at leadership. Go ahead.
The other comment I'd make to you, is, this issue is not just the machinery. It's all the, I'm fond of this OEE measure as a measure of reliability more so than downtime. Downtime is an element in a reliability process. But if you don't have the right raw materials and the right quantity and the right quality coming in, if you don't, do your changeovers appropriately, if you don't sequence things properly, if you don't manage your production schedule, if you don't have the operator starting up, shutting down, and so on, the equipment properly, then all the things you do in maintenance aren't going to be worth very much. All you'll do is find the problems after they land on your doorstep. Well, they're easy to find. They're sitting at your feet. So it's really important that you get back and again, you start thinking at a systems level, working with design and production and engaging the workforce in helping you resolve those problems. So yeah, anyways, the technology helps, but it's like having a hammer. That hammer is not much good unless you know where to pound the nails.
So looking at leadership, are there a couple of traits that you could advise companies to look for in leaders when they're out looking to hire some new people?
Well, that's actually an easy question and a hard question. I look for people who are open to, they're firm in their convictions.
Yeah.
And they want to, state what the objectives are and so on and so forth. But they're not so firm that they won't listen. Because, there are too many leaders out there who are autocrats and they dictate, mandate, demand. So I would look for somebody that's, they seem to be competent. They know what they're doing, but they're open to feedback and suggestions. And in fact, they solicit suggestions from their staff. One of the things I used to do is at our staff meetings, I would say, here's what I want to do. And here's what I think we need to do. Now, don't let me do anything stupid. So if you see a flaw in what I'm proposing, or if you see a shortcoming or something just plain stupid, and because of something I don't know, don't let me do something nutty.
Right.
And so, I like folks who are confident, but not overly confident, and who solicit feedback. But, once you have that, then you got to make a decision and run with it. And everybody should be on board. And them that aren't on board, well, maybe you can have a chat with them and convince them to be on board. And ultimately, you may have to decide that, well, this isn't working so well, because you've got to have that alignment and that cooperation amongst the workforce. And I know people use the word collaboration. Sometimes it's contentious collaboration. And as long as that energy is directed properly, that's a good thing. But if it's directed in a with animosity or with a desire to put your personal objectives above the corporate objectives, then that's a bad thing.
Right. So nearly every leader that I've ever met, when I talk to them, they have a course or a book that they took at some point in their career that they said made a difference. Was there one or two of those in yours that you'd like to speak about?
Well, I think the book In Search of Excellence was one of my favorites. Tom Peters.
Yeah.
I had the pleasure of meeting him. And I've got stories. I've got some more stories that aren't suitable for public consumption, I suppose. But yeah, I thought his book was really good. There are other folks. Winston LaDay, his definition of leadership
Yeah.
The different characteristics of leadership I thought were excellent. You got executive leaders, and then you've got operational leaders, and then you got shop floor leaders. Um, you know, I
And
think
there's
that,
different demands for each.
yeah, but the key when you have that is all those guys have to be aligned to a common purpose
Yeah.
and working toward that purpose with some simple guidelines and rules that allow them to do that, and some measures that foster, cooperation and collaboration where they share in the ultimate outcome of the company's success. So those are a couple. There are others, Warren Bennis and Jim Collins. Those guys, those books are quite good, Good to Great. And Warren Bennis, he wrote a book about what difference between leadership and management. And, managers focus on day to day and, all that sort of thing. And that's a good thing. Leaders focus on the future. So those are 3 or 4 that I've found very instructive and informative.
So this conversation really does lead right from one question to the next, because I was going to ask you if you were forced to pick one way or the other, is leadership a natural skill or is it a learned skill?
Yes. Yeah, it's there are some natural inclinations. I grew up in a household that was loving and kind and so on, but had set high standards and expectations. And it was a wonderful household. Mom and dad were just, I can't say enough good things about them. So some of that was natural in the sense that it's what I knew growing up. So
yeah,
it wasn't different when I got out into industry, in the sense that, you set high standards and expectations, but then you offer instruction and guidance when those aren't met. So it was natural in that sense, but then it's learned in the sense that as you try these things, or as I've tried things, and sometimes they work really well and you go, wow, man, that worked great. Am I good or what?
Yeah.
and then other times you go, oh boy, I wish I hadn't done that.
Yeah.
But
and,
what I've,
that's one of the things when I think of my career as a leader and a supervisor and manager, when I look at my own company, those times that you do make mistakes and they're people mistakes, boy, you lose sleep over that, right? And it's one thing. And I'll say that, in my career, when I look at the difference between the leaders and managers I worked for, the leaders were ones that were strong enough that when something like that happened, they came back and they circled back and they said, hey, I didn't really deal with that probably the way I should have.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Well, you're willing to admit a mistake. But I think the best leadership training that I had was when I was at West Point. That was an arduous
I had no idea you were a West Point. Right.
Set of years. And you start out, they make sure you understand you are lower than whale poop. And then slowly but surely they assign, and you don't even know it when you're there. You're just trying to get by. But slowly but surely they assign you with greater and greater and greater responsibility, and groom you and mold you into a position of leadership. And that's all done with certain basic fundamentals, fundamental principles around the motto: duty, honor, country. And an officer is responsible for everything his unit does or fails to do.
Yeah.
I thought the fails to do was kind of harsh. Why would you hold me responsible for some wingnut out there doing something I had no control over. Well, the point is, you have to be proactive and look for the wing nuts before they do something nutty.
Yeah.
and step in and take some action to minimize the risk of that happening. So it was quite an adventure, and I'm eternally grateful, for that experience.
Very good. So it's pretty common to hear that you can either be a leader or a manager. Is it possible to be both?
I think you have to. If you look at Warren Bennis's model, leaders look at the horizon, managers look at the day-to-day stuff. Well, you can't look at the horizon and ignore the day-to-day stuff. So there has to be a link between the two. My view is, wait a minute, what's happened here? This meeting has been upgraded by the host, whatever. Okay.
She gave us unlimited time. That's what happened.
Okay. Well, just looking at Warren Bennis's model, you have to make sure, that you look at the horizon, the future, you try to inspire people, but you also have to make sure that things are being done properly. So what I suggest to folks is the closer you are to the work, like first line supervisors, you have to be a manager. You got to make sure things are being done right. You got to make sure precision standards in place, the training to get done, and so on and so forth. The higher you are in the organization, the more time you need to spend over in the bucket he calls leadership, watching the horizon. Make sure the right systems are in place. As a manager, you make sure the systems are actually being deployed. As a leader, you make sure the right systems are in place. So I think you tend to bifurcate between the two.
Right.
But again, the higher you are in the organization, the more time I think you need to spend in the leadership bucket. The closer you are to the work, more time in what he calls the management bucket. And he's got a set of criteria, for that. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't repeat every single one of them. But one of them's focused on getting the work done, and the other one's focused on making sure the right systems are in place to get the work done.
Very good. So you've written two very noteworthy books in your career.
I guess the others weren't.
Well, every time I think of your name, I think Making Common Sense Common Practice and What Tool When. Those are the ones that come to my mind. And I do realize you've written more, but those are the two that when people say to me, hey, what should I read? Those are the two books that I typically recommend. Hey, pick up Ron Moore's book, especially for the young folks that are coming up, the reliability engineers, where you see something to them and you go, boy, there's something that somebody that's going to down the road could make something in their career if they move in the right direction. Looking at those, and I've always been pleased by the discipline you took in making the example of the company, right? And what we all see in our own different company. And I think that's what makes both those books special. How did you come up with that process? Was there something in your mind that said, I think this is the best way to go?
Probably two or three things that led me down that path. One of them is my wife. She said, you ought to write a book. And I said, well, I don't want to write a book. Geez, it takes too much time. And she said, well, I wrote a journal article for, I don't remember, plant services, plant engineering, one of those. And there was a topic that I thought deserved more attention and it wasn't getting it. So I wrote an article and submitted it, and they accepted it. And, they came back and said, yeah, that's good stuff. You got any more? And my wife said, you ought to write a book. So I started thinking about, okay, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be articulated. And I was having a discussion with a guy named Sandy Anderson over in England. And at the time I was thinking about or working on the book. And Sandy said, tell a story. And I thought, tell a story. Oh, okay. What kind of story am I going to tell? And Sandy, by the way, he's now an OBE, Order of the British Empire.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, so he got to meet the Queen. He's a super good guy. He's one of my favorite people in the world. He's one of those leaders, that he's kind but firm. He's demanding but supportive. He's that kind of guy.
All right.
Anyways, so I thought, well, how am I going to tell a story? And as I was writing these journal articles on various and sundry topics, I started to think about, well, maybe if I created this fictitious company, and I came up with a name, Beta International. Everybody's done beta software.
Yeah.
Well, this was a test. Okay, this was a beta run, and I created this, CEO Bob Neurath or Neurath. Well, that's a play on words. New wrath. My wrath is coming for you because things aren't going well. So anyways, I started formulating this story about this company that was in deep duty. And at the time I was working with a company that was in deep duty, So that opening chapter where you talk about Beta International being challenged with foreign competition and high costs and, the usual suspects, that was to some extent based on the work I was doing with that company at the time.
I've often wondered if it was my old company, Eastman Kodak.
They're in there. Because I did some work there too.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, when people read that book, they say, well, you talking about my company? There's something in there for everybody, because I've been exposed to a lot of companies that, they don't do things very well. So that's an opportunity to tell a story about how you make it right. Yeah.
So is there one, speaking of all those companies, that you're most proud of?
Is there one
company that comes to mind when you say I've worked with a bunch that really made a turn on things that you would say you're most proud of?
Huntsman Dioxide is one.
All right.
They were previously a part of ICI.
Yeah.
And ICI is dead now. They divested themselves into so many different companies that they disappeared. They literally divested themselves out of business. And Huntsman Dioxide, again, they had the right mix. They had good products, good markets, good leadership that had that balance of not being overly prescriptive, but being demanding and yet supportive. And there were lots of good folks there that made that happen. In fact, I'm still in touch with many of those people.
Very good.
Yeah, just last couple of weeks, I've had exchanged emails and so on. One of them that worked with them, they weren't directly a part of Huntsman Dioxide. He's a business partner now. So, but yeah, that was a good experience. I don't know.
Wouldn't it be my phone that would go off during the presentation?
Yeah,
and it's even on silent, so I'm not quite sure how it managed that. But technology is wonderful sometimes. So
I get a lot of junk calls.
We're going to close for today, but I have talked with the folks at Mobius and said, "Wait, I think, Ron, we could probably do an hour or a couple and talk about some different subjects, even outside of leadership." So I would like to invite you to come back and do this again some point in time.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Yeah. So at any rate, we will sign off. This has been the Leadership Connection. I'm Doug Plucknett, and I'm wishing you all a great day and hope you enjoy our discussion that Ron and I had today. Have a great day. Thank you.
Happy to help. Bye, guys.